This is the Overton Pod. Hello, Kanthan.
Good morning, John.
How are you?
I'm fit and fabulous as always. How are you?
You're
doing?
looking great today, I must say.
I think it's got everything to do with the fact that I've been, riding through magnificent Johannesburg with the top down in the car, in windswept hair.
In your
and-
convertible,
Absolutely. What else could one ask for?
dodging the potholes.
Well, the trick around the potholes when you have a convertible that's reasonably quick is that you actually drive quickly over them. So you literally fly over the
Yeah,
potholes.
it's basic physics, Kanthan.
Yes, because then you don't have enough time for it to actually you drop in. So yeah, it works fine.
Wonderful. All right. So drive at speed in Johannesburg, and that is the solution to things. It
Well-
also prevents people from hijacking you.
Yes, but then the trick, of course, is that you need to accelerate as soon as you see the pothole. So you can cruise along at 60, but it helps if you've actually got that supercharger in the car that kicks in at a moment's notice and just gives you that oomph to get you over
That's
it.
great.
So it works. Yeah,
It's great.
physics again, like you said.
Yeah.
But physics is racist, John. Don't you know this?
Well, you did see that UCT has, is very close to being successfully decolonized.
Yes,
So-
I know. It's and you've got to love it, right? I mean, but
It's what they wanted.
can we show respect for people who are willing to pay the price for their principles? I-
80 million rand worth
yes,
of price
yeah,
or whatever it is that
especially
they've lost.
since these are decisions that get taken by people whose personal salaries will not be affected.
Oh, absolutely. Nor will their educations, because they're over the age of 50 probably, and they're set
Yes.
up. They're fine. It's like Anton Harber, I saw, penned a whole article. Of course, I didn't read the article, but I got to see
Is
snippets
Anton
of
Harper
it.
still a thing?
Apparently, he's somehow still sucking oxygen out of the atmosphere. But the point of the article he wrote, again, which I didn't read the actual source material because I refused to give clicks. But essentially, the principle is no, white people are not being discriminated against by any laws in this country, Kanthan.
Well, then I'm sure it's fine for him that he can carry on with his life.
He can. And I'm sure at age 65, 70, 80, whatever he is, it doesn't matter whether you're being discriminated on because your job career is over. You're not applying for positions anymore. You're not trying to further yourself. You are where you are and you've made it, and that's great for you.
So going back to the question of UCT and universities in general, just want to get this message out there to everyone.
Yeah.
In exactly the same way as you having a collapse of public education in terms of the school system. The same has been happening at an accelerated rate in universities for the longest time now. But the flip side of it, which is great, is that nearly all of the major universities of the world have made their best courses available online, free. So really, if knowledge is what you're looking for,
Yes, but knowledge is
there.
not what people are looking for.
Yes.
Kanthan. Credentialism is what people
are
are
looking
for.
for credentials. And
Unfortunately,
I'm
because
saying save all that money, spend it on an internet connection, get yourself focused on actually learning stuff that,
Yeah.
that's completely out of your zone of your comfort zone, shall we say?
Yeah, I got you. I just, unfortunately, I mean, I'm with you. You've made the same point around schools to a different extent, but my concern is that the system hasn't shifted yet. So when you, for example, let's say you want to study all about economics and finance, and you really want to end up in banking and ultimately venture capital.
So banking as we know it, again, is going to be
is going
completely-
to, but today,
Yes.
this is the problem. Is that there is
but
going
take
to
the view that if
Yeah.
you're going to be spending 3 years on getting a degree, or 6 years, as most South Africans do, by the time you've completed that 6 years, everything you've learned is obsolete. In any case,
Yeah, and unfortunately, it's just what I'm referring to, which is if you go look at most job descriptions currently, advertisements, they will say what they're looking for, and in that will be very prominently featured the degree that they want you to have. And if you go to them and say, look, I don't have any of that, what I've done is I've taken the best courses from Yale, Harvard, Stanford, Oxford, and Cambridge in this field, and I have done all of them. In fact, I've even got these online certificates, no degrees, but I've got certificates to show that I did these online courses. They will not, for the most part, there may be some visionaries here and there, but for the most part, they won't let you through the door. And until that changes as a fundamental reality of the society that we're in, the shift won't happen.
I think that shift is going to come a lot sooner than we expect. And the financial services sector, I think, is going to be the single point that is going to be most impacted. Because, of course, I've got an entire chapter in my book about this, around the need for the banks to actually be whipped in line. Just by the way, on that point, before I forget, on the 17th of May, which is a Saturday, I'll be doing a meet and greet at Nickelway Exclusive Books.
Is it still called Nickelway?
No.
I don't think it's allowed to be called Nickelway anymore.
It's called the Winifred Mandela Precinct. But I'll say Nickelway.
Just you need to just avoid the burning tires as you drive into the parking lot. But yes,
no, I think the burning tires are normally waiting for me inside. No, but but my point being, in terms of looking at the banking sector in particular, I think that there's going to be seismic shifts coming in there. And I'll touch on the reasons why in a little bit. But we still haven't decided what we're talking about. So
no, well, we haven't.
What are you going to be talking about?
We haven't. I mean, I do think it's interesting. I mean, the UCT thing is interesting. They've lost a whole bunch of funding, essentially because they decided to take sides, I suppose, with regards to Israel, Palestine, some would say Hamas, actually, in terms of how vociferous and vocal they've been. Some would argue they might have been anti-Semitic to students on their campus. We've seen similar things go on with...
Look, they took sides 10 years ago when they took down the statue of Cecil John Rhodes, after they allowed students...
They took cultural sides.
Yes.
Yeah, Western civilization or not.
Yes, and the decline really goes back to that point. And there's no coming back from it, in as much as people think that there's a possibility of turning around the educational structures in this country. It's not going to happen.
So I think what's interesting is you talk about the collapse of these. I think that's maybe where the collapse will come from. We're seeing globally. So UCT's lost a whole bunch of funding. That will also mean that they will slowly start to drop in the rankings. I can get into how those rankings work because I was once quite involved with WITS and getting WITS up in the rankings. But essentially, a lot of it comes down to having international students and the volumes of international students. So UCT's ranking above the others in this country, and UCT has always ranked the highest in South Africa on the international sort of Western rankings that matter. And the sole reason for that, if you took international students out of the deal and just ranked the South African universities against each other, UCT would probably come third or fourth, actually. But because Cape Town is what Cape Town is, and people have always been attracted to UCT, it's got a huge number and it gets a lot of points for that. But that put aside, I'm interested in terms of what's happening in universities in general, which comes into the political now, which is what's gone on American campuses. And I'm quite interested in your take in terms of what's happening with this guy that the Trump administration is trying to deport, because it's an interesting
So
case.
which guy in particular are we talking about? Because there's a couple of academics that have already been deported.
So nobody, as far as I know, nobody's been deported. Some of them are in holding currently because there's court cases pending. So they haven't actually sent them back yet. There's a couple, but the one I'm referring to,
there is one person, I believe from Colombia, who is an Indian citizen whose whose student visa was revoked.
Yeah.
Sorry, not student visa, her academic visa, let's just call it that, under which she was studying in the US, was revoked while she was outside the country.
Yeah.
And of course, there have been people who have been screaming academic freedom and all of that kind of stuff.
I just want to see. So the guy's name. I'm going to forget this guy. I'm looking
for
it
people
up.
who are listening
Khalil,
rather than watching at this point, John is now taking the extraordinary step of furiously Googling as we speak.
Because I don't usually do that, you will admit, right?
That's absolutely
normally
correct.
straight off the cuff.
Yes,
Whatever's in my
straight off
head.
the cuff, yeah.
I couldn't remember the guy's name, but I think surname I think is Khalil, and you're correct. There's been a number of these cases. There was another woman who went to. I'll get back to Khalil now, but there was another woman who went to Turkey and then via Turkey to Lebanon, and then ended up at the funeral of Nasrallah, who was the head of Hezbollah, and then came back to the States. A doctor, renal transplant specialist, or something like that.
Yeah, I do recall the story.
And so she also had her working
and she was
visa.
denied entry.
Yeah, they stopped her at Boston Logan and basically said, what's the story? Why, we've got these photos on social media of you at this Hezbollah funeral, essentially, with, all the head honchos. She was kind of taking selfies with everyone. And now she's also being held, but they want to send her out. Marco Rubio, Secretary of State or State Department, has revoked their visas. And there's a lot of debate around this. But it seems to me that the point I'm getting at, and Khalil he helped with the protests on campus. He shut down like part of Columbia University. He was the main spokesperson for this group that was very sort of radical and violent. And essentially the Americans have turned around and said, well, this administration has turned around and said, look, you violated your green card, because he has a green card. The point I'm making is that I feel like the universities in the States, and I think this will have major effects globally, have kind of exposed their bellies. And that it's becoming clearer and clearer that universities aren't as much places of education anymore as places of radicalization and homes to radicals. And that, in fact, academics are really not there in search for truth, which is what an academic is meant to be doing at a university, but they're really...
I don't know about search for truth. Maybe search for knowledge would be one thing, but...
well, yeah, I mean, we can go back, to Socrates, etc. But the point is that they're there to push an agenda, to push a certain bias, and you have entire departments, entire universities really colonized, I
but
suppose,
essentially the reason
which
for
is
that,
hilarious in the context of decolonization.
but essentially the reason for that, and you and I have talked about this before, is the fact that you've really had this administrative capture of structures, which is pretty much what happens in terms of governments around the world, where you have this bureaucratic class that basically establish themselves as gatekeepers of everything that goes on within particular structures. And the same is true. You see this in the healthcare sector, which
I know you have a passing, as a journalist.
You have a passing interest in. You see this in almost every sector. The bureaucratic class ends up capturing effectively the means of production to quote.
No, that's 100% correct.
To quote Marx, and that means that the entire purpose for which the structures were set up in the first place falls apart. But you see, the more interesting thing right now is what's happening in terms of people having a complete rethink around how these things are happening. And are we at the stage where if you're applying for a particular position in a company, that they're not simply going to be taking your degree certificate, that they're actually going to make you sit down and do an exam on the spot, where the exam is very conscientiously tailored to the specifics of the position that you want to be filling. Sure. And they've got you on the spot, and you sit right there and you show that you actually have the knowledge to be able to go through that process. I think we are, because if you look in terms of, again, the rapid evolution of these large language models, companies are now in a position to say, design a test for me that is going to look for the following skills in people, and it needs to be a written test where it needs to be completed within the space of 2 hours, as an example. And I think that is going to be a far more effective means of actually hiring people than counting on the fact that they have a degree that comes from an indoctrinated university.
Yeah, I mean, I can see all these things happening. I'm pointing to the start of the cracks. I think that these Ivy League universities, which globally are recognized, other universities in other countries want to have links to them. I think that the cracks are really starting to show quite heavily, and really across the board, because we know that there's been an infiltration of every kind of course from a political perspective. You can go to the medical profession and find Marxism having neo-Marxism essentially having infiltrated that profession. You can go to the legal profession, find the same thing. My concern is that I don't think the corporates are going to save us from this. I don't know. I see what you're talking about, but who's the first mover to do that? You've got corporates who are obsessed still with ESG, even though they don't talk about it that much anymore because it's a bit persona non grata.
Well, I've noticed a dramatic shift just in terms of ESG. So if you look particularly in terms of the S&P 500 companies and ask yourself how many of them are still focused on ESG, I've noticed a fairly dramatic shift very quickly within the space of the first months of this year so far.
How many would you say though have, because on the one end of the scale for me is ESG, and the other end of the scale is what I call extreme merit, okay, and extreme merit and competence, which is what we should be selecting every single human on earth on, except in situations where we're looking after people who don't have that. But those are the two ends. And so they've abandoned ESG perhaps, or they've pretended to abandon ESG, because while they may not be talking about it, have they fired their climate people? Have they gotten rid of their gender departments in the middle of their bank? Why a bank has that? Who knows?
So in the South African context, expect that essentially the banks in South Africa, the majority of them, well, certainly the big four banks, are very firmly walking lockstep with whatever government wants to do.
Yes.
Right. And which is why you have the situation where they're able to do things like debanking people without due process in place, just simply because of the fact that, people end up being in the political spotlight of the government. And this used to be the case in terms of the U.S. as well, where literally you had Melania Trump not being able to get a bank account.
Yeah. And I'm not sure it's yet repaired, to be honest. Where are we on that scale, though?
But the repairs are coming.
ESG, but actually get to merit, because
But the
I don't
question,
see it.
you see, the more important question that we need to ask ourselves is, where are the companies right now that make enough of an impact on society as a whole, where that is actually going to make a difference? And I think we can agree the financial sector is probably, way up there in terms of that list.
Tech and finance.
Yeah, but again, if you look in terms of tech, we don't have tech giants to speak of in this country.
Oh, yeah, no.
Yeah. So the tech giants in terms of the US, absolutely, meritocracy is now very quickly accelerated once again to the top of the pile. So, and it really started at the point at which Musk walked into Twitter and immediately laid off 80% of the staff and keeping only those that were there because they are good at what they do.
Yeah.
And you see the same processes now happening across the board in terms of all of the federal government departments. So you are going to have literally an 80% reduction across the board in the number of personnel. So you kind of, without...
I think you're being optimistic, but sure.
No, I don't think so. I think that at a very practical level, I'm seeing this stuff happening on a daily basis.
80% of those staff?
I think that you're going to see 80% reductions across the board,
All
by
right.
and large.
I mean, I hope
So,
you're right. I mean, I'm not saying I'm not saying no.
Yeah.
I want 80%.
You see what generally...
I think we're going to get like, if we're lucky, we're going to get like 40 to 50%. There's a lot of, we must talk about what's happening there.
Yeah, but you see, generally what happens in terms of your outlook versus my outlook is that more often than not we agree on the principles.
Yes.
But I'm generally far more accurate in terms of the pace at which things happen. And I tell you, this is going to happen within a 6-month time frame. And you say, no, actually, hang on a second. No, that's not going to happen.
I think 80% of the U.S. federal government being fired is very, very unlikely because, so just to give you, that would be, there's about 3 million people who work for the U.S. federal government. I think it is something like that. 3-4 million people. You can check me on it. Whatever the number is, if it's 3 million people, and we say 80% are going to disappear. I don't know. I don't know if I see 2.4 million people, 600,000 left. That seems to me to be quite unlikely. And also, I think maybe in an entirely free system where they were just allowed to do as they please. But there's obviously been a lot of obstacles, 16 injunctions, I think, against the Trump administration so far. Give you an idea, 14, I think, against Biden in his entire four-year term. So we've got 3 months, not even, of Trump, 16 injunctions. They're basically going to just do lawfare against him for his entire term. And so that's going to slow roll a lot of those things. There's a lot of the US aid thing is completely shut down, but there's a number of people who are still on so-called payroll because they're sitting at home waiting for the courts are trying to save them. The Democrats are trying to save them. That's I just don't see it realistically taking place. What do you see that's different? What am I not picking up on?
So what I see that's different is that for the first time, we're actually seeing the administration turning around and saying, no, actually, we are going to proceed with our plans. And we are not ignoring the courts, but we are saying that we are going to challenge every single thing. And we are going to accelerate all the way up the chain. But we are not going to allow a scenario where you have a renegade judge in a very specific district blocking things at a national level.
Okay, so there's been several of these. Let's get into this because this is a nice, juicy topic.
Yeah.
So I think the big one is this Judge Boasberg, who is the chief district court judge in Washington, D.C. And he made a ruling a couple of weeks back now, a week and a half, whatever it is. He made a ruling whereby the Trump administration was deporting Venezuelan gang members and sending them off on a plane to El Salvador in that instance, as it happens. And he said, you can't deport these people. Now, firstly, they're illegal immigrants. Let's just start there. So,
well, more to the point, these immigrants were put on a plane.
Yes.
And he ordered the plane to turn around and come back.
Yeah. So,
and the U.S. government said, sorry, it's already in international airspace, so you don't have jurisdiction there.
Yeah.
And Bukele,
and it's national security and all the rest of it.
And then Bukele then proceeded to tweet in response to
Oops.
Oops. Yes.
Yeah. No. But the main principle is they're deporting these people under something called the Alien Enemies Act, which is very old. It's Civil War time kind of act, post that, but 1800 thereabouts. And the Trump administration is saying the act says that if any foreign military or invader basically comes and threatens the security of the United States, you can summarily get rid of them. And it's well ruled upon case law. It's actually been to the Supreme Court.
Well, this is a law that's been on the statute books for close on 200 years.
Yeah, that's right. And it's also been to the Supreme Court and been ruled on and found to be completely constitutional, etc. But there's this judge who's now acting as an activist. He's very clearly a very deep blue Democrat. And
well, it's more than that. His daughter happens to be closely associated with an NGO that makes massive amounts of money in terms of ensuring that these illegal immigrants are looked after. But I think let's let's just kind of gloss over all of the various cases that are happening right now,
Sure.
because I think that the full process there hasn't played itself out yet. But the more interesting thing for me, and I was listening to a 1.5 hour interview that Scott Bessent did with,
He's great.
Treasury
Secretary.
Yes, the Treasury Secretary was, in South Africa we call them the finance minister. In the US they call them the Treasury Secretary, and where he was basically outlining what his priorities.
The Treasury
are going to be.
Secretary is more accurate, I might add.
Yes.
Because
Yeah, it really
actually,
should be,
if
yes.
you run a government, then what you are in charge of is the Treasury. It's not your money.
Correct.
It's not your finances. And you
Well,
it's
very much in South Africa. It's the department is called the Treasury.
That's
but
right.
We call the person.
The terminology is very important to me because
Yes.
I feel like finance minister has this implication of controlling of money and deciding what happens. And actually, Treasury is what it's meant to be because it's not about that. It's about collection and distribution
Correct.
of that money appropriately.
Right. So in the case of Bessent, and he was talking at length about what he's planning to do. The most fascinating takeaway that I got from the start of this interview, did you know that he was part of George Soros's team?
Yeah, no, I did know that. It was very controversial when he was nominated.
So he was part of George Soros's team. And in fact, he was the guy who came up.
He actually was actually mentored by Soros.
No. He worked for Soros, but he is the guy who came up with the concept of shorting the pound that actually made Soros that amount of money. And he was telling the story that he went to Soros and he said, look, I see an opportunity out here and I want to spend a fair amount of money on actually exploiting this and seeing where it goes. And Soros said to him, well, how much money do you want to? and he said, well, all of it. And Soros looked at him, as if to say he's nuts. And then Soros actually went with him. And so he pulled off the shorting of the pound. And they very quickly were accumulating 20% a day over the course of the next week. Now, just imagine 20% a day compounded over.
Yes, I mean, and also if you were to make 20% per annum on your investment, you would consider that an excellent year.
Yes, yeah.
20% per day is just, it's unheard of.
Yeah. So what I'm trying to say is that Bessent is flippin' smart, and I urge people out there if they've got 1.5 hours to, in addition to the hour that they spend with us, to go and listen.
Who was
to
that with?
That was with the guys from two of the guys from the All In podcast. So it's
Chamath.
So it's Chamath Palihapitiya and David Freeberg.
Yeah.
And who are both former Democrats, by the way. I just want to put that out there. Fascinating conversation, and to a large extent, Bessent is talking about what they are trying to do in terms of completely upending the way in which the economy of the U.S. actually works. And if I want to distill this thing down, it basically what they're doing is looking for approximately $3 trillion a year that they want to be finding in a relatively short space of time.
I think the context on that is that the United States currently needs $6 trillion a year to operate. That's their budget. And $4 trillion of that they collect in revenue, and $2 trillion they need to borrow, which is why the debt, the American debt, is currently $34 trillion and will be $36 trillion next year. So they lose $2 trillion a year and just keep adding trillions onto their debt, which is unsustainable because a large portion of that, the same as here, what happens is as your debt increases, your debt repayment increases, and therefore your proportion or your percentage of your budget that is just debt repayment slowly goes up until the point at which what you're doing is all you're collecting is actually just paying off debt, and then you don't have money to actually service your needs.
So Bessent was talking about the fact that his brief from Trump basically said, we need a way to fix this without triggering a recession. And it's a flippant smart statement of what actually needs to happen, because we know the very quick way that you can actually fix stuff, which is to just have a period of austerity. But you know that people who
Don't
actually
like that.
No, but the people who end up paying the price in terms of austerity are people who are lowest in terms of the totem pole. And you don't want that situation to actually be happening, particularly since you've been elected on the promise of making the country great again. And you know what's going to be what needs to be done, which is to actually dig yourself out of that debt hole, but at the same time to do so in a way that the uptick in everyone's quality of life is still going to be there. And a lot of people don't understand all of the pieces that come into play at the same time when you're trying to do this. And if I want to drill this thing down, and I'm just doing a kind of an executive summary here based on a very large conversation. So there's basically three major pieces of the puzzle that they are looking at.
Yeah.
And so the first piece of the puzzle is Doge, Department of Government Efficiency. Okay, and the idea there is to try and look for massive efficiencies in terms of the way in which government actually runs its business, so that you're reducing the cost of business, of doing business for the government. And Doge is effectively looking at pulling back at least $1 trillion.
Yeah.
Okay, so that's one piece of the puzzle. Now, another piece of the puzzle is the fact that Trump is offering these golden visas. Now, if you do the numbers in terms of golden visas, they've done a calculation around the number of people who might potentially want to be pitching up and taking advantage of this.
That's the green card that you pay $5 million for, and essentially, as long as you pass basic security checks, you get that green card immediately.
Exactly. Yeah. So it's $5 million per person.
I think the way they termed it was U.S. residency for life.
Exactly. So if you crunch the numbers around that, they've immediately worked out that there's between 1 to 2 million people around the world who would immediately take advantage of access to that scenario. Especially if you couple that with the fact that Trump now has a commitment to slashing the company tax rate from in the current low 20% to 15%. Okay, so you suddenly got an incentive for people to be moving their companies to the U.S. simply because the tax benefits are going to be absolutely huge, and a $5 million outlay for that. I mean, Chamath, for example, who was talking about, says that he's very happy to immediately put down $5 million for each of the members of his extended family to be able to take advantage of it.
Yeah,
which he can afford to do because
he's 100 millionaire, I think.
Yeah, well he's 100
well above there.
Yeah, but certainly he manages assets that are many billions. So one piece of the puzzle. So we got $1 trillion that we're looking at in terms of Doge. If you have 200,000 people taking up the offer of spending $5 million apiece, that's immediately giving you another $1 trillion.
Yeah.
Okay. So that's immediately $2 trillion out of the way.
Is a once-off, though.
It is a once-off, but bear in mind that Trump is looking for the biggest wins in the shortest possible time. Okay. So that's the second piece of the puzzle. And the third piece of the puzzle is tariffs. And 1st of April is coming up, and it's 2nd of April.
2nd of April, Labor Day, isn't it?
Yeah, but Trump was very clear that he chose 2nd of April to put it in place because he said the mainstream media is going to be, if I launched it on the 1st of April, the mainstream media is going to be making April Fool's jokes about it, and I'm not going to give them that opportunity. So we're launching it on the 2nd of April. Essentially what happens in terms of the 2nd of April is you're going to have reciprocity in terms of tariffs. Now, we've spoken about tariff structures peripherally in the past, but to put this in perspective, right now, in terms of the way in which our relationship works with the U.S. under AGOA, if you have all of the cars that are manufactured in South Africa, so Mercedes, BMW, Volkswagen, Toyota, if they're manufactured in South Africa, those enter the U.S. duty-free. But if the U.S. is exporting cars to South Africa, those don't enter here duty-free. There's generally we pay 100% tariff if you're importing a car directly from the U.S. That's not manufactured
is it
in
that
South
much?
Africa. Yes, because that's the reason why we don't import cars from other parts of the world. I mean, if a C-Class Mercedes that's manufactured in South Africa costs a lot more here than the same car shipped across to Australia. But, we can't go across to Australia, buy the car, and then ship it back out here because that's just the way that's just the way these things end up working. So reciprocity in terms of tariffs is going to immediately mean that there's going to be a substantial uptick in terms of the amount of money that then flows in the direction of the U.S. government. Now, a lot of people have been saying this is an incredibly stupid thing to be doing because it means that it's going to make the cost of goods entering the U.S. a lot more expensive, but people forget that the U.S. is literally the biggest market in the world.
Yeah.
The U.S. imports more than any other place. And you, as an exporter, no matter where you happen to be, there's no way you're writing off the U.S. as a market because of tariffs. You're going to factor it in to the cost of your product, but that money is then flowing through back to the Trump administration. So what you've got right now are those three pieces of the puzzle that are then going to immediately address the bottom line in terms of how the entire Team America actually ends up running.
Mm-hmm.
But now the second piece of the puzzle is what happens with the money that then flows in from these various sectors. And that's where Trump's sovereign wealth fund now comes into play. Because he's saying, we're not going to take this money and pay off debt. We're actually going to put this into the sovereign wealth fund. Why are we putting it into the sovereign wealth fund? Well, because the S&P 500 actually outperforms the Fed's interest rate.
The debt interest.
Yeah, the debt interest. Okay, so we take the money, we put it into a sovereign wealth fund, we stick it, and then the profits from that are actually what is eventually going to accrue to the American people. So you'll get to the stage where things right now like Social Security, okay, which everyone has been worried about, and they've been saying Trump is going after Social Security. No, actually, what he wants to do is to actually take Social Security and make it so profitable that it becomes part of a sovereign wealth fund and is actually going to be addressing lots of things.
Frankly, it's the only way to have Social Security.
Correct. Yes.
It's the way the Nordic countries do this. It's the only way to sustain Social Security because you cannot actually, otherwise it's unsustainable. In fact, there's harping on about how Trump's going to get rid of social welfare and Social Security, socialized medicine for the parts of it that America does have, Medicare. But the reality is that whether Trump gets rid of it, whether the next president gets rid of it, America will stop being able to afford its Social Security obligations sometime between 2028 and 2032. That's what the so-called experts say. Right now, they'll probably just borrow more money and try to pay it off. But that just means you're going into debt to pay off. So you cannot afford it. That's what that means. When you go into debt for something.
Which is why they've been trying to do a lot of stuff like shifting the age of eligibility for getting access to Social Security and all of those things, which has been happening throughout Europe.
Yeah.
And which is why you've been seeing, literally riots on the streets of France because of the fact that.
Listen, this is this is a young but an old model. The whole idea behind Social Security is young in the overall scheme of humanity. There was no Social Security until the last century. Then we came up with this idea that we should have retirement and that people lived long past their working age, which wasn't generally the case. Before we industrial revolution and we invented good plumbing and decent healthcare towards bacteria, things like antibiotics and these types of things, chances are you weren't going to make it. We know this because life expectancy has got shot through the roof in the last 100 years. Maternal mortality, all of these things. And so we came up with this idea that, okay, if you work your whole life and give a portion of it to the state will keep it safe for you because, of course, they're so trustworthy. The state will keep it safe for you, and then you'll be able to call it quits at work one day when you're old enough, 60, 65, and then you'll get that back. You'll get all that money back, plus a little bit more, because over time they said, well, we're not just going to keep it in a bank account. We're now going to have these investment corporations, like South Africa has the IDC, for example, and we're going to have ways to grow the money, and then we'll give you all your money in theory, all your money back over your remainder of your life. But that concept is not a very new concept. It worked for a period of time, and it's starting to fail. That's just the reality. And it's starting to fail for a number of reasons. One is that the economies of those countries...
Well, the biggest reason, John, and we need to understand this, is that if you had not had inflation at the level that you've had, the money that is in the Social Security Fund would have been enough to actually fund people's lifestyle. But you literally had the Biden administration printing more money in 4 years that had never been printed in the history of the United States.
Yes.
Okay. So all of those things. But so to just swing us back now to the concept of how Trump is trying to engineer the way in which things get done over the next 4 years is to a large extent to just completely rip out the basis under which people have been running these systems and to replace it with something that actually does work at a market level. Because, if you had just simply taken the entire Social Security Fund 10 years ago and stuck it into the S&P 500, there wouldn't be a conversation right now about how to save the Social Security Fund. But the law doesn't allow you to do that because, the law actually prescribes that it only needs to go into exactly like we have prescribed assets here in terms of our own retirement annuities. They have these constraints that says that you're literally tied to using bonds issued by the Fed as a way to actually grow this. And so Trump is basically saying, we're not going to touch that, okay, because we're not going to go through an issue of trying to rework how Social Security works. What we're going to do is to be building an additional fund over and above that. So the entire deal that he signed off with Ukraine around access to their minerals and money that flows from that, the money that flows from that goes back into the sovereign wealth fund. That he's coming up with. The money that comes from tariffs, again, to the sovereign wealth fund. And in the meanwhile, what he's banking on is he offsets what's coming from the sovereign wealth fund by dramatic reductions in taxes for people on the ground. So you're reducing corporate tax, you're reducing personal income tax, which effectively means more money in the pockets of people. So let's say you are importing stuff. Let's say it's TVs from Korea. And you're importing the TV from Korea and suddenly it's costing you
20% more.
20% more.
Sure.
But if the people on the ground now have 20% more income in their pocket because of a reduction in taxes, it's a win-win scenario, right? Because yes, they are paying more, but they've got more money and they can afford to pay it. And if they don't want to be spending it on the TV, then they can actually be spending it on stuff that's more important to them.
And the government stopped digging a hole.
Yes.
I mean, most importantly.
So there are all of these pieces that are at play. And the fascinating thing about the way in which Team Trump is doing this right now is because you've got all of these very smart people across every single government department who actually understand what the big picture is. And more importantly, they understand what their role is in terms of actually bringing this big picture to fruition. So Musk is very clear. What his job is to actually create efficiencies. And these efficiencies take place at just so many levels. So one point, for example, is that the amount of licensing fees that get paid for running all of these various structures, just the software infrastructure that runs the Inland Revenue Service, as an example, and there's hundreds of millions that get paid out there in terms of fees. So what Trump has now done is he's gone to Silicon Valley and he said, okay, guys, here's what I want you to do. I want you to build the entire framework for me in terms of how we run this department, the IRS. And we want you to do it for nothing.
Yeah.
Now people say, well, why does Trump want them to do it for nothing? Well, it's very simple. If Silicon Valley delivers this, what's the upside? They deliver the most efficient system in the world, and the case study is the biggest system in the world, which is the U.S. government. They then able to sell that to almost every country around the world that's looking for efficiencies, and that's where they'll make their money. And at the same time, because of the fact that Trump is getting it for nothing, it means he doesn't have to go to Congress and ask for permission.
Is he getting it for nothing? I mean,
Yes, he will.
So I saw an interview with a software engineer who's working with Doge, and I mean, clearly a smart guy. You could just hear, the way he spoke about the topic. And he was talking about the IRS, and he was talking about the fact that they've spent the last 35 years modernizing their system. Now, that was meant to take 5 years. It started in the 90s, I think, he said. And he said they've taken 35 years to do something for 5 years. It's now, I think, more than $1 billion over budget. And they're nowhere near. And he was talking about how the software is basically written on COBOL, and which is no longer really a basis for any kind of programming in 2025.
A lot of systems in our banks right now still use it.
Yes, I know, which is a problem, again, because this is why I don't know if you've ever been, if you end up not at the front teller, or you end up going to some system in a back room, or if you ever go to any kind of government department or whatever it is, and they have to do something that isn't on the sort of main page, front screen, Windows looking thing. What they do is they open something that looks very similar to DOS. All right, it is DOS, essentially. You'll know what that is, and I know what that is. I don't know how many listeners do. But the old command prompt that you used to have a black screen, and a colon C, colon bracket. Like that's what we're running on. Like a lot of the stuff is very old. In fact, the same goes for the air traffic control stuff that they're trying to update. All of that stuff was built when computers first came about. So we're talking about like early 70s, and all of this technology is very, very old. And what's happened is over time they've just like built stuff on top of it and patched it and tried to make it work, and it's all very, very, very inefficient. And when something goes wrong, you've got to go like really quite deep into the code to try to figure out what's going on. And sometimes it's impossible to rectify.
Which is why Trump is basically saying, we're going to completely rip out this stuff. But the reason why it'll work from the perspective of companies actually giving it to the U.S. government for nothing, if you look in terms of the outlay that would be required to actually produce these systems, compared to the budgets that the big tech companies have at their disposal. Okay, can a big tech company actually afford to drop $100 million on actually building the system?
Probably.
And the answer is yes.
Yeah.
They can actually afford to drop $100 million on building these systems. Is that $100 million then on the assumption that the system works from day one? And the reason why it will work from day one is because the parameters of these systems are very carefully defined already, because you know exactly what's needed. It's not like a startup where you're going to come up with a use case and try and persuade an audience that you actually need to be buying into an ecosystem. I wonder if there isn't
a little bit of cart before the horse, in the sense that, for example, the US tax code, I think, is something like 150,000 pages long. Okay, it's actually impossible for a normal person to understand the tax code. Even people who are tax practitioners in the United States don't fully understand the tax code because it's it's become so complex, and they keep adding. Every year they add a couple of thousand pages or something.
Yeah, so simplification of the tax code is very much another thing that's part of the Trump agenda, and he's got.
You do sound like a cheerleader today.
Huh? Yeah. So, but he has actually got this commitment in place that for every one regulation that we put in, we need to actually be getting rid of, I forget if it was 10 or 100.
It's 10, yeah. Apparently 10.
Something like that.
If we pass something, we want 10 gone.
Yes.
Yeah.
But again, if you're building these systems from the ground up, building a knowledge of all of these complex regulations directly into the system is incredibly easy, because right now that's a large language model problem. Okay, because you're actually going to be giving the large language model a fixed set of data. It's not like you asking it to come up with an explanation for something it doesn't know.
Here's the tax codes.
Yeah. here's the tax codes.
Yeah.
Here are the various inputs that I have as a particular person. So I think, for those of us who draw salaries to this day, when we're filing tax returns with SARS,
Yeah.
nearly everything is already taken care of. Okay, because
PAYE.
your retirement annuity certificates are already on file with SARS, and it's been factored in to calculating what amount of money is due to you, what gets paid to you. Ditto in the case of your medical aid certificates, all of that kind of stuff. It's already in place. So by and large, all you have to do is to actually just go through the list, say yes, that's there, hit send, and then it's going to either send you a bill or give you a refund, as the case may be. Now, imagine the same thing then being applied to the entire U.S. tax code. I think that this is a problem that becomes solved very, very quickly. And more crucially, if you're putting in place these systems, remember that it's not just at the level of inland revenue that ends up benefiting from having these systems ripped apart. So air traffic control, like you said, another good example. Again, it's a solvable problem. The inputs that you get from aircraft have risen dramatically, but the ATC systems have actually not evolved to be able to process the input that's coming in real time from aircraft, and to be able to make real calculations at any given stage.
I mean, also it's quite insane that we've had sort of predictive computing for quite some time now, and there essentially is very little predictive computing involved in that particular sphere. I mean, there is some air traffic control, for example. When two aircraft are closing in on each other, it will give them some warning, but not nearly as much as it probably should. The predictiveness is very linear. And certainly with AI, it should be able to do far more than it currently does. So I think, they're great areas. What I want to maybe get to is, okay, I'm not American. So how does this benefit me or you, or harm us potentially?
So...
Because for me, I'm looking at it going, all right, I get the tariff stuff. What irritates me about the tariffs conversation, why I can't really have it with most people, is they go, he wants to do tariffs. Tariffs are stupid. You shouldn't have tariffs. And people on my side of the aisle politically have the same conversation because they fashion themselves as libertarians or whatever, and they decide that tariffs you should have free trade. Free trade is a great idea. And the problem I can't get through to some people is that there is no such thing as free trade on the planet currently. It doesn't exist, okay? You and I can have free trade, okay? Because as individuals, we don't make up silly rules, and we don't belong to organizations like the WTO, which is allegedly a free trade organization, but exists to do exactly the opposite of free trade. And so what happened was, originally there was free trade. And then they decided that, as you mentioned at the beginning of the show, there had to be a bureaucracy. And unfortunately, there often doesn't need to be a bureaucracy, almost never. And when there's a bureaucracy, then people need to make up rules, and they need to make up ways things work. And they do things like, for example, the World Trade Organization turned around and said, well, if America, the world superpower, is going to trade with China, this up-and-coming country, which is trying to bring its people out of poverty, and really is struggling, they can't be on level footing. They can't have that. Wouldn't be free trade. So what they did at the time was they said, well, America has to give China everything as a free trade entity and allow China to sell into America with no tariffs. But if America wants to sell things into China, it's only fair that they pay a tariff.
But remember that this was essentially Nixon's master plan. To go back to the beginning, but I think the crucial thing, and you're absolutely right in terms of the history of the WTO, which is essentially where the entire globalist agenda effectively begins. But I think the crucial thing for us to recognize is that now you've got this complete upending right now in terms of the way in which these things are happening, and it is going to immediately translate to a global scale. And the reason why it's going to translate to a global scale is because the U.S. ultimately controls just so much of that stuff. So one of the things that Bessent was talking about, for example, he was asked what is the most unexpected thing that he came across when he started the job, and his response was, I had no idea how much of this job actually involves national security. And he spoke very specifically about the fact that he had been briefed well in advance of the airstrikes on the Houthis. And the reason why he had to be involved in it is that there was an entire process that took place before the airstrikes were in place to identify a range of the key players who were responsible for funding and so forth, and then to yank them out of the global financial system just before the strikes actually took place.
Which he needs to do.
Yes, which he needs to do. And, you know, once you understand how all of these pieces are kind of, you know, interconnected, it actually, you begin to understand how they're not just thinking of pulling apart one piece of the puzzle. Okay, it's literally going into every single arena, upending it, but more importantly, upending it at such a dizzy rate that people who have relied on a sense of inertia in these institutions are not able to keep up, simply because of the fact that they can't move quickly enough to get in place. So how that then ends up translating to what happens with us. I suspect that every single country around the world that actually fails to keep up with the stuff that's happening right now is going to be caught completely flat-footed at a number of levels. Now, South Africa, we've been in that scenario for the past 30 years.
Okay? What, flat-footed?
Yeah, because I mean, consider, well, actually 30 years is unfair because, you know, up until 2008, we were doing very well in terms of economic growth. But if you look at the period since then, where all of the BRICS countries, we've touched on this, have they've been posting steady and sustained economic growth, and we haven't. Why? Well, those countries, by and large, have been relying on actually improving their efficiencies, getting rid of bureaucracy, making it easier for their people to do business, scaling back in terms of taxes, all of those things that, you know, anyone with any sense knows is actually the way in which you grow an economy.
Yeah, modernizing, westernizing, you know, the traditional meaning of those words, what those words would have meant in the 60s.
Yes, yeah, before the, and, you know, to a large extent what economies in Europe used to be before the EU came about.
Absolutely, yeah.
So, yeah, all of those pieces of the puzzle, as I said, and where does that leave us?
Well, I think what's interesting is, I don't know if you saw this, but the Brenthurst Foundation, which is basically the Oppenheimer's think tank.
Yes.
They fund it. It's very influential. It has links to all the political parties. They've come out, I wouldn't say in support of Javier Milei, but certainly citing him and saying, look, Argentina and South Africa have a lot of similarities, economically speaking, certainly in the concept of growth, which is exactly what you're referring to, and how stagnant growth was. In fact, Argentina had negative growth. And here comes Milei, and he's come up with a number of ways in terms of changing the government, changing the economy. And they're essentially saying maybe we should be looking at some of these ideas. Not on my bingo card. The Oppenheimers, who really are staid globalists, essentially, you know, again, stuck in the world of Francis Fukuyama. And I think that is a massive shift. I know it looks small at the moment. It's one or two articles published on their page, and it's neither here nor there. But I think it's very interesting that people with that level of influence are starting to notice that kind of stuff. I've also noticed that, I'm going to forget his name. We've discussed him on the podcast before. Former CEO of FNB, and
you're talking about Michael Jordan.
Bank Zero, yeah, Michael Jordan.
Just want to point out that that's Michael Jordan's name.
There you go. There's your camera.
Michael Jordan.
On the forward of your book.
Yeah.
All right. So you're such a slut.
Where I'm going to be having a meet and greet at Nickel Way at 12 noon on the 17th of May.
Yeah. Okay.
Stick it in your diary.
He's also said a couple of times, he's referenced, what's going on there. I think what's interesting about Milei is that there's not so much culture war stuff in Argentina. Argentina's really dealing with survival, which is sort of what South Africa's doing. I know we have some culture war stuff that happens in our suburbs.
Well, one of the reasons why we're not in that position is because of the fact that we have the social grants framework that is still keeping the majority of this country not at the point of absolute poverty
yet.
But you and I are both aware that we are now at the point where there isn't enough money to keep paying those grants.
So given everything you've said and all the stuff that the Trump administration is doing, which I think is, I agree with you, is excellent and has great potential, and I do hope it works, because I think it potentially rewrites the way things are done. You know, I referred to the WTO and trade not actually being free, and you've referred to the way governments do things and revenue services and computing and all of the stuff. And it's really is time for us to say, all right, what has worked, what has clearly become very cumbersome and just difficult to work with, and what needs to change. What ideas that we've had for the last 100 years do we need to get rid of now and move on with other things? And so I'm excited about that, but you know we're sitting here in a country that clearly needs to change something. Now, whether that's possible or not, there's lots of debate. We can get into it, but the reality is it's interesting that people who are able to move the needle, because I think I hate to take away the mystery and the mystical nature of democracy. But I want to tell you
what's the mystical nature of democracy?
People believe that they vote for the party that they believe in. South Africa, it's we vote for the party we believe in, and then they put the people that we voted for into parliament and into the government.
Is there anyone out there who believes that?
And those people actually control things. Okay, and then, you know, the reason Des van Rooyen was removed from that position had nothing to do with a couple of people from boardrooms phoning the president. It had everything to do with the people and the outrage from the little people on the ground. Sorry to tell you, but all the big decisions happen by people who have influence, essentially. And so I just think it's interesting that people with influence are starting to talk about ideas like the ones Javier Milei has. And I'm quite, there's a little bit of a glimmer of hope there, because together with what Trump does, together with Milei, and then hasn't really hit South Africa yet, but Bukele.
It's only going to hit South Africa at the point at which we have a charismatic leader that's actually able to command the attention of the masses and be in the point at the point where he is able to step in and do that. And I say he very deliberately, because it's not going to be a woman.
No, it won't be a woman. It has to be a man.
In our particular context.
It just is what it is.
And I can't see that happening in the short term, simply because of the fact that there is too much investment right now in racial division in this country. And until we get to that point, it's not going to happen. But at the point at which you have someone who is going to come in and say, at the most very basic level, if you elect me, I am going to get medieval in terms of taking out violent criminals.
Yeah.
A single thing that anyone does right now will immediately unite the entire country.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. You know, it's interesting. You say we don't have, but I feel like we do. There's lots of people with the potential to do this.
But they're not talking about it openly.
No, but someone like Gayton, if he just stops talking about everything else and just markets himself as the tough law enforcement party, I think he picks up a lot of votes. There are people in the DA, for example, who could go this hard. I mean, I can't stand JP Smith, but he's the kind of guy who could do something like that. He's not charismatic enough, in fairness, but he is the type of guy who is very much believes, you know, I personally, I think he probably has an SS outfit hanging in his cupboard. That's the level of like how much love he has for authoritarianism. There are people who potentially could do this. I just think it's interesting that the ideas are now starting to trickle down, where that hadn't happened before. You know, Milei is not a new thing. He's not a new concept. But again, these ideas, and it's not about whether they trickle down to the bottom. You will not see our media saying positive things about these other regimes in other parts of the world. But you are seeing people at high levels talking about the successes in these other countries from ideas that are relatively new certainly in terms of practice at a state level in the past 50 years, put it that way. And so I think that's good. On the racial polarization, I have to agree with you. But the racial polarization stuff's happening because they've got nothing else to hang on to, right?
Correct, yes.
We're at the end point. We're at the end point. I don't know. There's never a real end point, right? I often say to people say to me, we'll go the way of Zimbabwe. And I say to them, well, I know people who live in Zimbabwe today. And they're okay.
Yes.
They don't have lots of luxury goods, and they may not always be able to choose what they're having for dinner tonight because it's a little bit erratic in terms of food supply sometimes and money supply even. But people still live there. You will live. This is what I told people during COVID. You came from cavemen. They woke up in the morning with nothing. Maybe they had a skin as a loincloth and a stick and a rock that they found in the bush. And they woke up in the morning with nothing, tried to get some food for themselves and their family and not die, and then went to sleep at night, hopefully in a cave. Okay? Until you are in a cave with a stick and a rock, you will accept almost anything, any scenario. So there's no the end of the country. There's no such thing. There's just the end of this particular phase. But I do think we are reaching that specific end. And, the budget is a good example.
I'm looking around to see where your stick and rock is right now.
My cell phone and... every guy loves a good stick, though. I mean, that's just stock standard. I mean, when you see a good stick lying on the beach or something, I mean, it's great to find a good stick. Separate discussion. So we're coming to that kind of endpoint. On the polarization, I think that's getting worse. But at some point, it either becomes very relevant in the terms of some sort of violence, and with expropriation and all of that stuff, it's obviously there's a cloud of that is a major concern, or it comes to the point where everyone goes, I don't really think this is actually my main priority, and I just don't care to focus on that. Now that'll be a political question, I think. I'm not convinced the way the fight is happening. I wanted to discuss this. The way the fight is happening from the two sides. So let's take the Afrikaner sort of and black nationalist fight that's going on. So you've kind of got ANC, MK, EFF. It's not the whole ANC, in fairness to them, but they've passed the EWC Act, so they're going to get lumped into that group. You've got MK, who make a lot of noises. We really don't know what they stand for on this, but they do seem to agree with the EWC stuff, although they want to be the people to enact it, obviously, and not against their own, because that would fiddle with the Zulu stuff. And then, of course, you've got the EFF, who's the mouthpiece of the most vociferous and disgusting sort of propaganda, right? And then you've got the Afrikaners doing the, stuff that's going on with the states, and obviously reaching out to international bodies, defending themselves and defending what they own, which is perfectly within their rights. And I'm not sure that's helping anyone. Because the Afrikaners, for example, the American thing, the Afrikaners get told, well, you can have refugee status. We don't know how that's going to work out, and I'm sure some will take it. But from my perspective, majority of them have turned around and said, well, we don't want to go anywhere. This is our home, right? And much as people tell us to go back to Europe, we aren't from Europe. We're from here. So I'm not sure that fight's being had. I saw the other day on Human Rights Day, there was a freak out because Malema, knowing exactly what he was doing. I mean, let's remember, a year ago, Malema was a damn squib. Okay, his party dropped in the elections. No one really cared what he said. If you remember, the ANC and DA were having discussions. The MK was even involved in those discussions. And the one party that was completely excluded from those discussions was the EFF. So he was a nothing, and he knows that this is at least makes him something. So he goes up on a stage on Human Rights Day and he starts singing "Kill the Poor, Kill the Farmer." Now, I'm not saying he doesn't believe it. I'm just saying he knew exactly what he was doing. He knew that what that was going to create. He knew that that was going to get him publicity. He knew that that was going to put him back into the limelight, back into the media. And the freak out that happens to me seems like the freak out that happened around the N-word. And then that didn't happen around the N-word because black culture took that word and made it something that they owned. And to this day, they still own it in the United States. You know, black rappers use the N-word all the time in their music, for example. In black culture, it's perfectly fine, as long as you're black, to call each other that by that word in almost a loving way, right? It's like my brother. Now, I'm not going to use that word, and I'm not going to justify the word. But what I'm saying is they're saying "kill the farmer, kill the boer." Why aren't you singing the same song back to them? Like, add the word "come kill the farmer, come kill the boer," right? Use it as your own struggle song, for example. That's just one way you could approach it. I feel like there's not enough strategy in terms of taking the teeth out of a lot of this vitriol.
Except whose job is it to take the teeth out of that vitriol? Because you see, you've got an organized structure right now in terms of the EFF, which is essentially a political party. But on the other hand, you know, the bodies that nominally are representing Afrikanerdom, for want of a better word, are, you know, the likes of AfriForum and
Sure.
Solidariteit. And their core job is really not to be doing that type of messaging.
Because
maybe it should be.
Sure.
Yeah, maybe it should be.
Well, they're not a political party.
Yes, yeah.
And I'm not necessarily criticizing what they've done. I actually think that their messaging has become a lot better in the past few weeks. We criticized some of their messaging early on following the Trump stuff. But I think their messaging has been much better and much more on point of late. I'm just saying that if you want to stay in the country and the intention is to stay here and to try and build something for yourself in the country, I get that you may have abandoned the idea, some people have, of building the country that includes other people. I think long term it's just dumb to not do that because, I mean, I can't explain basic economics on this show, but that's just how things work.
But you see, that's the reason why the stuff that Trump is talking about, because
Yeah.
this ties in very nicely with this particular point. And so one of the points that Bessent was talking about is that, you know, he got asked, well, you know, what is the American dream? And the American
this
dream.
is controversial. I saw the clip.
Yeah, and
He turned around and he said the American dream is not cheap televisions and something else. He basically said the American dream is not about having consumer goods.
yes.
And the American dream is about being able to raise a family in a safe and prosperous environment.
Exactly.
I'm
and
paraphrasing.
which fundamentally then ties in with the concept of, you know, owning your own home. And then went on to talk at length about the fact that for most people who end up buying a house, the house is considered to be an investment. It's actually not an investment by and large because, you know, they never actually realize the value of it. And, you know, it's something that they potentially end up passing on to their kids. But at the same time, because of the way in which taxes get structured and all of
Yeah.
that, it never actually benefits as a real investment. But he says, but what has happened as a result is that you've incentivized the need for properties to constantly increase in value. And because you're incentivizing an increase in value, you're incentivizing an increase in the price point, which means that the entry point then for people to get into the market becomes a lot more difficult, again, because of scarcity. And we're seeing exactly the same thing happening with us right now. And he says the level at which you end up fixing this is by actually making it easier for more homes to be created. So he's not talking about, you know, building houses. What he's saying is that there are lots of impediments right now in terms of how people actually get past the starting posts in terms of acquiring a home. So, one of the things that he's looking at very specifically is how zoning laws actually prevent a natural process of evolution in terms of more homes being built in places where it would be appropriate for them to be built. Then he also looks in terms of the fact that the building codes that end up restricting the way in which homes get constructed go back more than 50, 60 years.
Yeah.
And the impediments that puts in place. And he says, why are we not doing more stuff that's actually involves homes being built in factories so that the cost of actually building a house goes down dramatically? And the reason why we're not able to do that right now is because of the fact that we're not incentivizing people to do that. Again, because
the code in 1950, when they made the code, said that the lumber has to arrive on site and then it has to be inspected by whoever who has a certain certificate and whatever. But now we can 3D print houses, for example.
Sure.
But according to the code, you can't, because you're not printing it out of lumber, for example.
Right.
So those types of
But you see,
things.
the crucial thing, again, is to get people out of the mindset that you buy your home as an investment that's then going to appreciate in value, that you're going to then pass on. Because the fact of the matter is that the only way that your descendants will get to benefit from that is by selling the home.
Yeah.
Right. And then, dividing up the money among themselves. But that's not going to be enough to get them past the starting posts in terms of becoming homeowners themselves. So how do you get to the point where you're changing the fundamentals of the system? Another piece of the puzzle then becomes making it easier to benefit, for the masses to benefit from the trappings of capitalism, which means making the entry point in terms of investments far more attractive than sinking your money into a home that's not going to be paying you an income or not actually growing future wealth for the sake of your kids.
Yeah.
At a philosophical level, if you consider that a lot of these ideas are actually coming from people who themselves are worth literally hundreds of millions of dollars. And they're looking at it from the perspective of how do we then raise the floor for people so that they actually have a stake in terms of supporting what we are trying to do, which fundamentally is to make more money. And you need to be giving them a slice where they can actually have a vested interest in the share price of Tesla, as an example. And
maybe not quite at the moment, although it bounced back a bit.
No, but it's a good one to think about, because what was his name? Waltz, was it?
Mike Waltz. Mike Waltz is national security.
Yeah, no, I'm talking about what was Kamala's vice president's?
Tim Waltz. I think.
Yeah, Tim Waltz. Yeah. So Tim Waltz was on stage last week, telling people how he was looking at his stock ticker and he was celebrating the decline in the share price of
Tesla,
because
he hates Elon Musk.
Yes, and yet his state has significant investments.
The pensions,
the pension funds of the state have a significant investment in Tesla. And who is it who chairs the committee that decides where those get allocated? It's Tim Waltz himself. And you see the level of absurdity that these guys are currently going to, just simply because of the fact that they want, and it's not dissimilar to the idiocy that you're seeing right now in terms of the ANC doubling down on their support for Hamas. You literally robbing your own people of the opportunity for prosperity by doing stupid shit.
Yeah. So let's bring that back home, because we went kind of racial polarization back to the States, back to here, and that is 100% the case. So everything that almost every decision made politically in this country in the past year has been a bad one. I mean, I don't know. Can you think of a single good one that's been made in the past year? Because I can't think of any major political decision in the past year that's been good. We've had, obviously, the big stuff that we know about, EWC, Bella, NHI. So those are all bad decisions for multitude of reasons we've discussed before. We've then got all the Hamas stuff, and wherever you stand on that issue, I think it's very clear where we do, but wherever you stand on that issue, we could have just shut up. We could have taken a much more conventional international approach, like every other country has taken, even those who are more on the side of the Palestinians. We could have just been a little bit more logical about that. Our foreign policy has been terrible on that issue. Our foreign policy with regards to the United States now with Rasul and what he did, just ridiculous. That welcome home party at the airport, I mean, that was also just so dumb. The negotiations we've had with Iran, and then back to internally the stuff that we've done to run down our cities, the stuff going on in Johannesburg, the stuff going on in other cities in the country, Durban. Obviously, I'm not going to pick on Cape Town because they're the supposed golden boy. Although I will point out that I constantly see them touting stuff that I look at and go, this is what you're meant to do. This is not like something to be proud of. So they laid some pipe the other day and were very proud of laying some new water pipe, 60 million rands worth of water pipe or something like that. And I just thought, well, isn't that what you're meant to do?
That's part of
Isn't that part of your job?
That's part of ongoing infrastructure maintenance.
It's like I'm going to tweet like the city of Cape Town, and in the morning I'm going to be like, got out of bed, brushed my teeth, went to work, did my job, and then expect plaudits for that. So I get that.
But
I get that the city
we have
works
set our
standards.
expectations low enough.
Sure.
That right now that we look at this and we say, yeah, I really wish that we could just have stuff that works around here as well.
I mean, the ESCOM stuff, there really isn't anything that you look at and go, this has been positive.
Well, yeah, I think in fairness to the DA though, it's an opportunity for them to be telling people in Johannesburg, well, you could actually be having the basics in place.
But the DA doesn't say. So I need to correct this and the DA, I'm perfectly willing. If I'm wrong here, I will issue a correction on the show, on the next one. But the DA does not say that they can fix Joburg. What the DA says is that you should vote them into power in Joburg, and then once they are in power in Joburg, every single one of their major reps will tell you that they will not fix anything in Joburg because it's not possible to fix anything, Kanthan. It's been too long of destruction by the ANC, and so it will take them decades to fix what the ANC has destroyed over decades, even though the DA ran the show for 3 of those decades, the 3 years of those decades. And so the DA doesn't actually promise anything about Joburg. They just say that they'll govern better, i.e. they'll steal less. But they're not promising that things will improve, because when you ask them, and I've spoken to their councillors and I've spoken to mayors and I've spoken to leaders in the party, they all parrot the same line. Joburg will take a very long time. You won't notice any changes for years. And that's their claim. That's their claim. And the other thing that the DA does when they get into power is, and they did this under Herman Mashaba. I saw it happen in my own suburb. They took the taxes and they proudly said that those taxes were going to the less fortunate. And the verges in my suburb where we used to walk, and the park not too far from where we used to stay, that never got trimmed. And the first time that those things got trimmed and the potholes in the road got attended to was when Herman Mashaba was thrown out and the ANC came back in. And I had to laugh because I don't think the ANC is a great governing party. But maybe they're less competent at stealing my money and sending the people to cut the grass in areas that aren't my area. But that's my concern with the DA. Like, yes, do I think they'd run Joburg better than the ANC? Absolutely and certainly. But I worry that their messaging is nothing can be fixed. Why? Why can nothing be fixed? Crime, for example. Take the Metro Police, who basically run roadblocks to collect speed fines. That's not actually a principal requirement of our society currently. We have rampant crime. Use those people for policing. Actual policing. They have police written on the side of their vehicles. Why can't that be done? Why can't you time clock your people that work for the city of Joburg in City Power and in Joburg Water? Why can't you time clock them and make sure that things are actually being done properly? The other day, the power went down in an area not far from me. And it went down on the Thursday. And the people only arrived to fix it on the Friday evening. And then did fix it. And you know what the comment was about why they came on the Friday evening?
Because they get overtime.
100%. Because on Friday evening, if they repair that at 6, 7 in the evening, they get overtime.
Yep.
But if they'd come on Thursday morning, it's just part of their job. Now, that's just management. That's not, it takes 10 years to fix the ANC's mess. That's just today management. Oh, you don't want to work during your day job? Not a problem. You're fired. I'm taking you to the CCMA. Okay, cool. What do you earn? 150 a year. I'll pay 75 and we'll never hear from you again. You know, that kind of attitude, that's the attitude needed from someone that's going to run this place. Unfortunately, yes, things have decayed really, really badly. And things are at it in a very bad way. But the only way to fix that, you don't fix that by slow peddling things and by being held hostage by employees and unions and stupid ideas.
I see the DA is not getting any brownie points whatsoever from you today.
Well, the DA will get brownie points when they start understanding how much of a crisis this is. And they stop being bureaucrats and start being people. Because I know...
But this comes back to the question, John, of who is actually leading the DA. And right now, it's not very clear to me at all will they, in fact, have a leader. But I think... Yeah, we're in agreement in terms of everything you've said in terms of the DA stuff. I'm, looking forward to next year's municipal elections with great interest. And obviously a lot needs to happen between now and then. But frankly, if the DA doesn't have a new leader before those elections, I think that there's not going to be a hope in hell that they're going to make major inroads around this stuff. But... what is the other thing that you had mentioned up front that we needed to be talking about? Besides my meet and greet at Nickel Way on the 17th of May at,
You're gonna kill me.
at 12 o'clock.
Yeah. I think this might be the first podcast we edit. Just so that your promotion is only once in the show, not like 4 times.
Okay. I can actually fix that by keeping the book on my shoulder.
Yeah. In terms of what else we needed to discuss, we didn't really. We did the usual thing, which was just getting straight
there
into
was
the
something
show.
that you spoke about at the beginning that we said we were going to touch upon, and it now escapes.
It
my
eludes
mind.
you.
It now eludes me. Yes.
I think we've spoken about. We did the university stuff. We did all of the deportation stuff in the States, and we've done a lot on the economic plan of the Trump administration. I think that's more than enough. What do you think is going to happen with our budget? Because it still hasn't been voted on.
Yes. When is it actually going to be tabled?
It doesn't seem clear to me because they've given this nebulous in April, I think.
Yes. Well, you see, SARS has already sent out guidelines around implementation of
the VAT.
Of the VAT. Yes.
At 0.5%.
I didn't actually go into the email.
Which is actually very difficult to manage, I might add.
I got the notification yesterday, and I've yet to take a look at it. But I mean, the reason why I have an accountant is because of the fact that the accountant will manage that as best it needs to be managed. So I'm fine with that.
Do you think the DA said they're not going to vote on that? Do you think they will stick to that? And if they do, who do you think votes for the budget?
So if they don't, who does that leave? That ends up leaving essentially the ANC. MK will not vote with them.
So that leaves the EFF, which gets them to 49%. But with ATM and those types of parties, they can probably just squeak over 50. So is that what's going to happen? They're going to give the EFF some red meat?
I don't know. I think it's going to be an interesting scenario if it does come about. And I don't think that the EFF is going to do it just to give a bloodied nose to the DA. I think the EFF is going to want something in exchange. I don't know what they're in a position to get in exchange, because, again, in order for the ANC to give them something in exchange, it means that they need to effectively end up undermining the way in which the GNU is put together. So what would the EFF actually stand to benefit from, if not, if they do end up voting with them? I really can't see it happening at this point. So
hold on. Because that creates an interesting scenario. Both create interesting scenarios. If the DA holds, the EFF does vote with the ANC together with the small little parties. I think Gayton may also vote with them because he has this whole unity thing as his sort of selling pitch for the last year. He's been like, look, I'm in the government of national unity, therefore I have to support it. So if that happens and they go through, the question is, what has the EFF been given in return? Which is interesting to think about. But the alternative is, okay, if the EFF says no and the MK says no and the DA holds their line, that means the budget is not approved. That means that they have to remove the VAT increase, which means that they cannot afford the budget. So the budget has to fundamentally change. They have to defund certain things, which would be great. Let's start with private protection or personal protection.
Remember, it's not necessarily to defund particular things. It just simply means that they don't allocate an increase to it. So if you take the public sector wage bill as a very specific example, one of the reasons why they need to be having this VAT increase is to be able to have enough money to be able to pay increased salaries to the public sector. So if you're capping salaries of the public sector, you don't have a problem.
The problem is they can't cap the salaries because they've negotiated at the bargaining chamber that those salaries all increase, and they increase sometimes in line with inflation, sometimes a little bit less, and sometimes more. You know, there's strikes, and then they'll agree that in the next 2 years you're going to get this percent increase this year and whatever.
So can you imagine now the unions now taking government to court, and government says, well, we'd like to pay you, but we don't have money. And the courts then have to say, well, where does the money come from? And the government is going to turn around and say, well, tell us what budget we need to be cutting in order to do this. It's not as clear-cut as people would actually think, because it is actually an opportunity for the government to be just turning around and saying, sorry, we can't pay you more. And frankly, it's in the interest of the country you do it.
The issue is that I think that that's great, and the idea would be, okay, all the public wage people, the public servants, always a hilarious term to me, but all the public servants then turn around and go, no problem, we'll just stay at our current salary. Obviously they strike and whatever, but ultimately they stay at their current salary, and everyone goes, okay, that's fine, we just move on. That's not what's happening. So already, for example, there's frozen posts all over the show. So in the healthcare sector, as one example, there's just frozen posts. Gauteng has hundreds of frozen posts that they're just not filling. It's not to say that they don't need those people. We're talking about nursing and doctors and specialists. It's not to say those people aren't required. It's just that they've decided they're not employing anyone, obviously because they've gone, well, we don't have the budget. So they're, instead of actually saying we're capping you to those people, they're saying you're going to get your increase, we're just not going to employ new people into the system. And bearing in mind, those aren't new people that are added. We're talking about situations where people have resigned, and instead of employing a new people into that position, they just aren't doing it. And
you say this as though it's a bad thing, John. It's actually a good thing.
It's good and bad, Kanthan, in that I don't mind the state collapsing, because I, as you know, believe that most services can be provided by the private sector. You've got to allow them to do that, though. And we've got the problem in that the state doesn't allow that to happen. And the collapse is in the process of that happening and the private sector not picking up the slack, there's a lot of damage that occurs to the average person on the street. And so I have a problem with that. And, the only way to solve that is by either making tough calls, which they don't seem willing to do,
It's not the only way to solve it. So let me give you a practical example of how this turns out. So let's say government has negotiated I don't know, a 6% increase in salaries.
Yeah.
So when government now no longer has money to pay salaries, then you have people go on strike. Now, when they go on strike, what happens? No work, no pay.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so let's say they go on strike for 2 months. Okay, the money that you then save by not paying them for 2 months, okay, means that you can then afford to then negotiate with them and say, all right, you guys can come back to work at the negotiated salary next month, but you've saved effectively 2 months out of a year in terms of your wage bill, which means you can afford it at that level. So,
I like that trick.
So it's maths. Yeah. Basically, if you come down to it. I'm saying that this is not as stressful a scenario as people might think, especially given the track record of people in the public sector to strike at the drop of a hat.
Yeah. All right. I mean, let's see. I'm just saying I'm seeing effects on the ground at the moment.
I'm saying that if the DA kowtows at this point, that it's not going to be well for them at all. On the other hand, if they dig in their heels, it's a great opportunity for them.
Sure. And I think they realize that because the marketing around this and the PR around this has all been to try and make people forget everything that's happened in the last 9-10 months, where they have really been railroaded and they've just taken it lying down. And the message here and the messaging has been, we are not going to give in. We will absolutely not allow this to occur. And so I absolutely think it would be a huge win for them if they don't kowtow, as you say. And I hope they don't. I hope they don't, because much as I've disagreed with a lot of what they've done so far, I think that this is the right move and they should absolutely do it. And I will give them all the credit should they follow through. And so far they have followed through. So credit for what they've done so far, because we were going to have a 2%. And if they'd said, okay, the budget would have been passed a month ago.
2 percentage points, John.
Yes, 2 percentage points, 13% increase.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think is what it works out to, roughly. So they've done very well on this so far. And really, this is the energy that they should have had all along, and hopefully will continue with going forward, which is, if you're going to be part of this government, then you need to stand by your principles and be unmoving. And if that means you risk the entire government, then so be it, because rather risk the entire government than risk the entire country.
Yes.
And that should have been the message all along. Unfortunately, they made this boogeyman of the doomsday coalition in their heads. And so in their minds, going along with every communistic fantasy of the ANC was saving the country, when that is a false dichotomy. Because if the doomsday coalition is as bad as you say it is, then the country's lost. And if you follow the ANC's communist plan, then the country is lost. And so you lose both ways. And I can only hope that there's some sense coming back to the party. But as you say, the leadership is not in a good way. It's unclear what's going on with John. Seems to be in disarray. It's unclear what's going on with Helen. I don't know if you saw Helen stood up at Biz News. I mean, Helen's become a boomer. There's no other way to put this. Helen's become the iconic boomer. She stood up at the Biz News conference, which maybe we must talk about, and she said, she basically railed against the Trump administration, all of the ideas you've spoken about, how terrible they are, and just cannot see the wood for the trees on any of that, cannot see any of the good ideas, is completely stuck in this Eurocentric globalist kind of idea. And if you made Helen the president of the country tomorrow and offered her membership of the European Union, we would be driving around with little blue and yellow flags on our number plates. And it's fascinating to watch someone who is incredibly intelligent. I need to say this. Helen is very astute but she is so out of touch on the political moment. It's quite unbelievable.
But no one can get their heads around an idea that they can't comprehend. And the reason why they can't comprehend it is because of the fact that you get so mired down in the way in which things have historically been done. We've spoken about this in the past, that when you get down to it, there's not really that much of a philosophical difference between the ANC and the DA, because they both believe in the idea of a capable state that is going to be driving things, except the DA believes that it's a non-corrupt capable state.
Yes,
But fundamentally, it's bigger government, not smaller government.
They also have a subject, not a citizen view of members, people in the country.
Yes.
Which is that we need to save our subjects, not let our citizens run free.
Yes.
And that's been demonstrated in ways both parties have behaved over the last few decades. It's quite interesting to witness that. And I'm just looking for the person in any political party who really understands the moment and who really gets it. And I'm not seeing it just yet. On the Biz News thing, I did criticize Alec Hogg because he had the Biz News conference. I like Biz News. I think they're good media. It's good to have competition. He certainly does compete better than any other alternative so-called media that is currently available, certainly in the mainstream space. If you go talk to someone in Rosebank or Sandton or downtown Cape Town, they know what Biz News is, like they know what News 24 is, right? And they've read some of their articles. So good for him, and he's built something good. And they have these.
Well, unlike the other guys, Alec doesn't really have an agenda.
Yeah.
And, I think that he will have this ability to platform as many people as possible, no matter what they, even though their views are highly contrasting compared to other people on the platform. So there's that. But go back to the conference. You were going to make a point.
Well, my problem was with not who he platformed, but what he didn't platform. So it's fine to have the people he has. It's fine to have Helen Ziller basically calling Trump Orange Hitler again. But where is the person like you standing for the 40 minutes roughly you probably spent on this podcast talking about what Trump's doing and why it works, or why it might work, or why it's at least a good attempt to challenge the status quo? Where's that person, right? He has Adrian Gore on, and I don't really know too much of what the content of what Adrian Gore's talk was. But the reality is that 5 years ago, almost to the date, Adrian Gore was one of the architects of lockdown and vaccine mandates, or at least pushing for those to occur, and masking and school closures. And he wasn't the only guy. There were many other people. But as a corporate face of lockdown, Adrian Gore's right up there. 5 years to the day, almost, he has the guy speaking there on leadership and whatever, and business and all the rest of it. This country's never recovered from lockdown. The economic hit we took during COVID, we never recovered from. We can, and there's ways to do it, and we need economic growth and all those other things we've discussed. But the reality is we took a massive, massive knock. And to have someone like that on, fine. If you feel you need to platform him, he is a business leader. He runs a successful company. But where is the person to push back against him? To say it's been 5 years since the most catastrophic economic decision, economic health and everything else decision made probably in the past 100 years of humanity's history. There wasn't that. But to his credit, I did criticize Alec and Biz News over this in exactly the same way I've done now. And Alec messaged me and said, look, this is, how we see things. He basically said, we're not agenda driven, as you've mentioned. We try to just give people information, data, let people talk, and, our audience will take what they want to take away from that, essentially. We're not trying to drive a narrative or anything like that. And he sort of kind of said, well, where's the issue? And I said to him, Alec, I just feel that if you want to tell people the story, then you need to tell them as much of the story as you possibly can. And if you're not trying to drive a narrative, then you need to at least acknowledge where the biases are in some of the people you are bringing onto your platform, and maybe try see if there's other sides of it. And also, I think there's a big problem, and always has been in South Africa and in every country in the world. And that's what I find refreshing about the Trump administration, the number of people under the age of 50 involved in that administration. Yes. And in fact, the number of people under the age of 40 involved at relatively high levels in that administration. And we're not doing that in this country. We don't do it in government, except for, loud mouths and boisterous children, essentially. But we don't do it with smart youngsters. We are not doing that. And in that media space, in Biz News, which I do read and do pay attention to, I felt that they could have included a couple of people on the younger side of the spectrum who exist and are out there. And I'm not just referring to me. I don't even consider myself part of that. But I do think that they could have been a bit more thoughtful about that. Anyway, he was very open, and I did message him, and he, thanked me for my thoughts essentially. And it's all good. But yeah, I think for me that's quite important.
Yeah, look, in fairness, if you consider the alternative to Biz News, which would have been the Daily Mavericks gathering,
yes,
which
used to be brilliant,
back in the days. I mean, I remember when it was at the Victory Theatre up here in Johannesburg, and you'd have really fascinating discussions by interesting people, and then it eventually degenerated into a classic woke fest, and I doubt it's ever going to be resurrected. I mean, who are they going to have? The usual suspects of Tuli Madonsela as well, and Zima Vavi, all pitching up and singing from the same hymn sheet. Adam Habib.
It's like a circuit. It's the circuit of upstanding communists.
Yes,
basically.
But but when you get down to it, there's not a single person among that lot that has actually created a job. Even a single job in their entire lives.
Yeah, you're right. Correct.
And if you want a measure of success in terms of what you've done in terms of running businesses,
adding value,
I think the single biggest example of adding value is creating jobs, based on the fact that you put in place a business and you've taken it from this point to that point and added so many people to the ecosystem. You've trained so many people who've gone on to do other things, all of that kind of stuff.
It's the almost literal interpretation of teaching a man to fish.
Yes,
that's what creating employment does. It's that. It's giving that to a person so that they can then support their family and go on to do that for other people as well.
Yes, but I think by and large you have a lot of these people who gather in these talk shops, and they all have an idea of what they'd like to see happening, but or what they'd like to see in terms of the type of country that we need to have. But no one understands the steps that are actually necessary to get from point A to point B.
I think that's
right. I think the single message that people could be driving, and really this requires, and if Alec ends up listening to this, the single thing that needs to be pointed out is that if you get rid of BEE and if you get rid of all of the trappings that hold back business, and you end up growing the economy overall, when you have economic growth that's at a faster rate than population growth, then you actually have more money to spend on all of the things that you want to be spending money on.
Yeah.
And the quickest way to get there is to actually get rid of stuff that right now is a tax on the economy. And BEE, I'm very clear, is the single biggest thing that is holding us back as a country right now.
I have no disagreement there at all. I don't know if you want to discuss anything further. We should call it a day.
No, apart from 17th of May, but
but you've now discussed it ad infinitum. I think it's enough. Right. So as always, thank you for listening or watching. We will catch you next time. We hope you enjoyed this particular show, which had no particular direction. But if you liked it, subscribe, share, tell your friends, all the rest of that good stuff. And we'll catch you next time. Cheers.